Well, hello everyone. This is the live streaming channel of the Blackheath Philosophy Forum, which is a community group based in the Upper Blue Mountains, New South Wales, Australia. And in Blackheath today, it's cold and miserable, as it often is. Governor Macquarie named Blackheath Blackheath because of the sheer bleakness of the place on the occasion he went through. So, before we get underway, I have to relate some very sad news. Last Sunday, Lloyd Reinhardt, who was for many years been the program director for the Blackheath Philosophy Forum, died peacefully on Sunday morning. And we were very shocked about that. He's been a long-term stalwart of our little group. He's a former academic philosopher. For a period, he was head of school philosophy at Sydney University. Anybody who knew him was impressed by his extraordinary philosophical erudition and his amazing global network of contacts in the world of academic philosophy. And that was vital to our little organisation because we were able to get world-class speakers because of that. For example, Professor Hugh Price, who's the Bertrand Russell Professor of Philosophy at Cambridge University, arguably one of the most prestigious academic positions in philosophy in the world, has spoken several times to our little group. So we're very grateful to Lloyd for all that, and he loved arguing about philosophy. Sometimes he'd argue about it to a fault. We'd had some pretty lively arguments after dinner, and sometimes they get a bit rancorous, but it was always over philosophy, almost always over philosophy. Just about everybody who knew Lloyd ended up having an argument with him, but I think all of us who had dealings with him came to value the contribution he could make to a group like ours. So he'll be sorely missed, and we've sent our condolences to his wife Janet and other members of his family. There won't be a funeral ceremony because of the current situation we're in with the virus, but Janet tells me that at some stage there will be a wake at their home, to which presumably Lloyd's old associates will be invited. So that's a bit of sad news to start off. Today we're having our first panel discussion. We're gradually getting used to doing things in this way. We used to always have physical meetings, but we've been dragged into the 21st century by circumstances, and we're starting to get the hang of this video streaming stuff. But today, we're having a panel discussion, and it's a follow-on from the talk I gave a fortnight ago, where I made the case for the overall theme for this year's program of talks, A New Dark Age, Emerging Threats to Free Speech and Liberal Democracy. And in the course of giving that talk, there was a very animated discussion opened up in the live chat stream. And quite a few things were said. Some were strongly opposed to the things I was saying. Some were supportive. But the virtue of the live chat is that people can, give these spur of the moment ideas. But we really need to be able to follow up these debates in a setting where viewpoints can be expressed fully and elaborated properly, and where we can have exchanges of views and discussion threads that can evolve and develop over time. Well, our website has the facility to do this. A while back we piloted it, and it actually worked quite well. So we're trying to revive it. And so the purpose of today's discussion is to describe how the system works and how you can get involved and how you can contribute. We don't expect to be getting into too much argument about the substantive issues, but we really want to prompt an active debate. And we're already starting to see it. I posted out the links to the relevant pages this morning, and already we're getting some pretty good contributions coming in. Now, today our panelists are, we've got 4 panelists. Andris Heks is a regular at the forums, and it'd be fair to say, I think, Andris, that you are rather strongly critical of what I was saying, and you made that clear in successive posts in the chat window. So that's one perspective. Another perspective is Antony Carr, who also posted in the chat window, but I think it'd be fair to say he's more along my line of thinking. And to cover the middle ground, we have Sheree Wax, who hails all the way from Balmain, and she sort of was half and half, I think, in her assessments. She partly agreed with me, partly disagreed. And finally, we have Andrew Tulloch, who's a young philosophy honours graduate about to embark on a PhD, and he's recently written a book about identity politics, would you believe? And again, his viewpoint differs significantly from mine, but it's a very interesting book and presents his case very well. So that's our little team for today. So just so you know who's who, well, they've all got name tags, so I'll just show each of them. This is Andris. Oh, there we are. We're all there.
It dropped out for a moment.
You dropped. I think you dropped out, didn't you? Anyway.
Yeah, big drop.
We're good. So that's the gang. That's the team. They've all got name tags. I'll just run through what we hope to achieve, and then we'll move on to discussion with the panel. And as we're doing this, you'll be able to post your ideas in the chat window. The chat feature of YouTube live streaming presents us with an interesting opportunity. As I said at the outset, with the 200 character limit, you really can't say that much. But the nice thing about it is that at the end of a live session, you've actually got a transcript of everything that was contributed. And what I thought would be an interesting exercise just to get things going would be to go through that transcript of chat entries and try and analyse and paraphrase the major lines of criticism of what I was saying. So everybody on our email list would have had a list of those 5 points or paraphrases of the lines of objection, and everybody on the email list would have had a link to each of a short article by me responding to each of those 5 points of criticism. And if you're not on the email list and therefore you don't have that, there's a link below the video which you can click on to go and view the articles, and you can also have a look at the raw chat for entries, and you can also look at a transcript of the talk I gave, which is the subject of debate. But what I hope to see is a civil and constructive debate where people can take perhaps quite diametrically opposed views, but address each other with respect and politeness, and actually, if you have a point of view, actually have good reasons, lay out the reasons for it. And what I hope to see evolve is some interesting discussion threads, initially around the comments that are made on the articles I initially posted. But the features on the website allow us to do much more than have comment threads. We can also have article threads, where if you so desire, you can contribute a full article with all the usual things you'd expect to find, such as word processor like features and the ability to embed videos and images and so forth. And there's essentially no length constraint on either comments or articles. If we start to run out of server storage, we'll have to deal with that. But I think we're a very long way from having to think about that. But we did run a pilot on this back in 2000 and at the end of December 2018, which actually went very well. So having given that rough outline of what we're trying to do, I'll just show you the home page, in effect, of this set of articles, which I hope to become a source of debate. Just give me a minute, I'll just get it up. Okay, this is the link below the video takes you to this page. This is just blow it up a little bit. Okay, so this article basically just describes what this is all about, and it sets out the 5 grounds of objection that people, my critics, claim that I systematically exaggerated the significance of identity politics and political correctness and the threat they pose to our civilization. Second point, that I've overlooked the importance of inequality, especially inequality of power, as a far more important factor undermining and destabilizing society. So these are the 5 points. Now, below you notice that if you go to the page, that there's a menu at the top, which allows you to respond to every item on the page in a variety of ways. At the simplest level, you can comment on an article, which in the initial stages, I suggest is probably the best way to go. But below this article, you'll see a menu of links to other articles, including my 5 response articles. So you can respond in a variety of ways. This edit item, you can edit the article or delete the article, but that only applies to your own articles. You can't obviously go and edit and delete somebody else's article. There's a share option here where you can get a link to the article or some embedding code, or you can social media postings, or you can upload an avatar if you want some sort of picture to appear alongside your contributions. The view menu, there's a variety of graphical views that can be made of the debate as it unfolds. I'll just bear with me for 1 minute. I'll just as I said, so people are already starting to contribute to this, and you can view a graph of the whole debate as it develops. And what you have here, it's a bit hard to see it, but that's the root article which I was at. These are my 5 responses, the blue items. The green items are sort of information items, which are the transcript, the original transcript of the talk, and all the chat and comment texts, which is kind of the basis of the argument. And then in addition to that, a number of comments have already started to appear on the articles. For example, one of the claims was that fundamentalist Christianity is a bigger problem than Islam in terms of being compatibility with liberal civilization. And Ron Catanzaro has started to has posted quite a lengthy comment on that. David Sanderson also. So you can see a graph of the whole thing as the debate unfolds. So that's the sort of thing that can be done. And what I'm hoping is that people will chip in. As I said, initially, I strongly recommend people just make comments, but I hope that as the discussion develops, more people will contribute full articles, and we can have article threads where one article might respond to another and might support or oppose the contentions of an article. So, you know, and with the website as it is, you can have a graphical view that includes both article threads and comment threads. So there's a lot there, but the initial step is just to click on some of the links which have been posted out to everybody on our subscriber link, and which will, if you click on the link and you haven't already registered on the site, you'll be presented with a little form where your Blackheath Philosophy email address will appear, and then you're just simply asked to give your first and last names and accept the terms and conditions, etc. And then once you do that, an account is automatically created and you're automatically logged in and you're good to go. So that's essentially how it works. And so we'll see how it develops. Okay, now we've got our panelists here. I might start asking Andrew, who participated in our pilot program. The functionality I'm described as pretty much the same as it was when we did the pilot online debate feature. So, Andrew, do you want to make a few observations?
Yeah, so, well, basically when it was running through, you were quite helpful with putting different ideas and different posts onto it. And I suppose at the time I could contrast it with the usual how the forums would go during the talks when everyone would show up, where obviously lots of people would have their own objections, their own questions, and the speaker would answer it. But if, say, the person who asked the question or raised the objection wasn't satisfied, there'd be a limit to how deep they could go into it, because obviously the next person needs to have their turn, and time is a factor. Where with this case, Peter would be able to put forward his argument, and because you can post it via writing an article or posting your own article, that gives you enough time to go right into the details. And I think that's the main advantage I saw with those kind of things. When I'd normally go to the forum, I'd ask a question, and then I'd hear it and say, well, I'm not too sure about that, but we just got to leave it at that because time's a factor. So I think that would be the main advantage I noticed from using that forum. So yeah, I'd highly recommend for people to do that as much as possible, and it can go as far as it wants to go. If other people are not interested in that, they're a bit bored with that, they just don't have to read it. But the two people can pass articles back and forth as much as they want, because the model allows for that. Whereas like if you talk about something which everybody else finds boring at the forum or on the YouTube stream, people might want to walk away and not be that interested. So that's the main advantage I think I saw out of that addition from Peter.
Okay. Well, thanks, Andrew. Now, does anybody else on our panel want to raise an issue or make a comment, or Andris?
Yes, I'd like to come back to the topic. And Peter, your whole criticism is based on a particular definition of identity politics, which you state as Sonia Crook's definition.
Yeah.
But there is also another definition of identity politics, which is in the Wikipedia, if you look it up. So my basic point is that there are at least two types of identity politics. One, which is divisive, which doesn't really contribute to expanding justice in the world. It just wants to replace one top dog by another one in the name of justice, but in fact, it's only a role reversal. The second type is when there is a genuine grievance, genuine discrimination against people, and the purpose of identity politics is to make the underprivileged equal, and it may emphasize the difference, but it's not an emphasis at the expense of others. Now, I want to give an example because we love to be in an ivory tower in philosophy. Let's come back to earth. So, let's take the civil rights movement. Now, the divisive identity politics, which you talk about, a great example, I think, would be the Black Panthers, the extreme Black Panthers, who not just wanted equality for blacks, but actually wanted black supremacy over white supremacy. Right? That was the first type of identity politics which you could legitimately criticize. But then there is the other type of Martin Luther King. Remember, he was saying, judge people by their character, not by the color of their skins. And here, even though he wanted the upliftment and equality of blacks, it wasn't at the expense of justice. It actually improved democracy, it expanded justice. And to lump all identity politics into one basket, that they all divisive and undermining democracy, I think is a terrible mistake, because some identity politics is actually very good for democracy, and eventually it becomes mainstream. So that's my starting point.
Well, what we're doing here is we're getting into the substantive debate. I'll respond very briefly to what you said, but I think you should set out those views systematically and post it on the website, and then I can respond in a very systematic way. But I just make two observations. I mean, you can take identity politics to mean anything you like. I strongly endorse Martin Luther King's statement that people should be judged by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. But that perspective is explicitly rejected by the modern iterations of identity politics. For example, did you know that the University of California, Los Angeles, with that huge university system, has issued a set of expressions which they deem to be microaggressions and not to be used by their staff and students. Among those is that I look at you and I don't see colour. There is only one race, the human race. Under the modern iteration of identity politics, those sort of statements are verboten. And so the Sonia Crook's definition of identity politics basically says that, people should speak as members of an identity or some intersection of multiple identities. And a very good expression of that viewpoint, which I find loathsome, it was given in a video on YouTube, which you can watch on YouTube, of Alicia Presley, one of the so-called Gang of Four radical Democrat members of the House of Representatives. And she said, "We don't want black people who don't speak as black people. We don't want brown people who don't speak as brown people. If you're a black person, you've got to speak as a black person." Now, what does that mean? Fact is, black people and brown people have a whole variety of views of the world, which may or may not accord with the current identitarian script. And people who deviate from that. Now, look, Andris,
May I comment on that?
On the web, and I'll respond in detail. Does anybody else want to discuss the basic approach we're taking? Sheree?
Yeah, just one, well, not so much the approach, but what Andris said before about the Black Panther Party, I completely disagree that the original Black Panther Party were black supremacists. There is, however, a new Black Panther Party, which is very much along those lines and has been mentioned by the Southern Poverty Law Centre as being a very racist group and so on. But I don't think that's fair to characterise the original Black Panthers in that way. I think they were very much about equality and correcting obvious wrongs of the time, which still persist. And secondly, when you're talking about, I think a much better example would be, say, the Nation of Islam, which was very much a black supremacist group, and that's why one of the reasons why Malcolm X left it and was probably murdered by them subsequently. But talking about, as you rightly say, Peter, about why should black people or brown people be unable to have dissident views in any way? Like, I feel that way often about Jacinta Price when it comes to Aboriginal speaking, sometimes Marcia Langton and other people who are frequently perhaps in the minority when it comes to Aboriginal voices. And then there seems to be pressure in some quarters for them to conform to what is maybe a more majority view, but I don't see why they should be any less entitled to their views than any of the rest of us. Like, all of us should be able to speak as individuals. The fact that we are part of various subclasses should not in any way impact on our ability to express our views and not be criticised just for speaking those views. We have those rights. People can debate what we say, but it shouldn't be on the basis of our identity. So I agree with you on that.
Okay, Antony Carr wants to have his two box work.
Yes, indeed, I do. One of the key things is to look at the fundamental basis of Western civilization, which is built on the sovereignty of the individual, which comes in a way from the Christian idea of man being made in the image of God, and that he was equally important whether he be king or commoner, a free or slave, white or black. And that's the fundamental basis on which democracy itself is built. That is the sovereignty of the individual. And in fact, I was glad the quote from, Martin Luther King was raised, because this is precisely his point. Because he has a dream that my 4 children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the colour of their skin, by the content of their character. In other words, they're to be judged as individuals, but not as members of any particular group. And I think that's a core part of our civilization.
Okay. Andrew, did you want to chip in? We seem to be getting into the debate a bit, but are you interested? Did you want to have a quick?
Well, I mean, just going back to what you were originally saying, I think the context of today on analysing debates, I mean, I would love to address all those ones individually. Some of them come up in the book that you were very kindly plugged for me. And I think this kind of, I'll address it from the idea about how debates work. Every single one of the topics that are raised right now takes a lot of time and a lot of energy to go into. For instance, talking about the concept of the individual being paramount under Western civilization. There's lots of arguments for that and against that. And that takes a lot of reading up in philosophy to do it. I think in a debate, there's always going to be a gap in the knowledge you would obtain from a debate. I think that's something always to be aware of. I always treat debates as conversation starters, not conversation enders, where a lot of people might want to watch a debate or listen to a debate and expect the latter, okay, am I a collectivist or am I individualist? I'm going to watch this debate and find out. You're either just going to take a side just off a mere preference on what sounded better, which tends to be not an attractive view from a philosophical position. So what I'd like to maybe see is when we do construct verbal debates, is to be aware that you're going to get, at best, an introduction to the topic. And if we take that position, we can think about what kind of questions we're going to ask, say, in the chat stream. Like in the chat stream, if you're going to raise this kind of like this real deep objection, it's not going to get covered in a debate structure like this. It's not going to happen. You might have, and so what you can say is that, okay, here's some objections. You're going to have to read into it more. And that's where maybe adding in those links, like the one you raised earlier, Peter, can work through there. So take, for instance, the discussions about Martin Luther King Jr. I mean, yeah, okay, yes, he did say that, but he said a lot of other stuff too, which a lot of people would link to identity politics. So I'd highly recommend people to listen to his talk, Where Do We Go From Here? And he goes into a lot of stuff on how African Americans should collectivize post-civil rights era. And there's a lot of stuff there that you'd see that might resonate today with, say, the Black Lives Matter movement, which a lot of people would attribute to a identitarian kind of way of thinking. So, but to argue that in detail and bit by bit is always going to have a bit of a gap. So, yeah, so I think in the context of the value of verbal debates versus written debates, like in the platform that Peter had, where you can post articles and go into the details. I think it's good to be aware of the advantages and disadvantages of those two different kinds of media. I'll leave that there.
Okay.
Could I respond?
Yeah, go for it.
Peter, I want to respond to, before Andrew, to the three of you exalting the virtues of the individual, and particularly you, Peter, criticizing that black woman in the American Congress, speaking as she did. I 100% agree with her. I find it very strange but amusing and consistent that conservatives always appeal to individual rights for free speech. Of course there is individual right. That's not what they're talking about. What she's talking about is there are genuine unresolved injustices against blacks as a group. Just because quite a few blacks broke through that injustice and became famous and accepted, that doesn't mean that there doesn't remain systematic discrimination against them. That is the important point she's making. So we're talking about false consciousness and genuine consciousness of injustice. And what she's urging, and this is exactly the issue that came up with Adam's Goods, yeah, and the journalist on ABC, what's his name? Adam Goods was playing on the field. Someone, a kid yells out and said, "Oh, you look like a monkey." He then picks up the issue, and then he's criticized for it. How dare he? Why does he do that? And then on the radio, we have the comment by another commentator who says he would be great to play an ape in King Kong. Now, that was an adult statement. What does this tell us about discrimination against a particular group? And isn't it then essential that every member of that group stands up and stands together, as Peter was talking about, the collective, and all of us who are sympathetic for justice stand shoulder to shoulder to work for justice? That's the point. And conservatives constantly use this argument, throwing in this furphy about the individual. I don't think it's right to either go for the individual or the collective. I coined the word a unicentric approach to things, which means neither the individual nor just the collective, but a successful reconciliation of the interests so that we got a win-win solution of increased justice. In unicentric, there is the word uni. That values the unique. And there is the word universal. That values the unique in the universal. So we need to have a solution that both values and celebrates the genuine uniqueness of the individual, at the very same time, promoting the common good, universal rights, the interests of everybody. That's it.
What am I doing? Did the wrong thing there. Yeah, just a few points in response to Andris. Andris, I must get that right.
Right. Yeah.
First of all, I'm not at all opposed. In fact, I celebrate things like the original civil rights movement that had as their goal the achievement of genuine equality for people irrespective of colour, and genuine equality for people irrespective of gender, and the ending of legal harassment of homosexuals and so forth. No argument, but those are noble, worthy movements. What I object to is, in the modern iteration of identity politics, is the idea encapsulated by the statement by Alicia Presley. We want people to speak as blacks. We want people to speak as brown people, because the subtext there is that there's a script that you're expected to adhere to and you're not supposed to deviate from. So, for example, somebody who says, in regard to Black Lives Matter, actually, if you think Black Lives Matter, your primary concern would be the fact that the vast number of violent black deaths are a result of gang warfare, as compared to the truly minuscule number of genuinely racist cop shootings. And there are some, but the numbers are very small. The practical effect of the Black Lives Matter movement was that, in effect, the police were disempowered from carrying out the kind of active policing that had been so successful in reducing crime rates in America over a period of decades. So that, if they see somebody who's engaged in suspicious behaviour, you ask questions and you try to see what they're doing. Because since the Black Lives Matter movement, any attempt to do that will result in the cops in America being surrounded by angry crowds, filming and so forth. And the result of that has been catastrophic. In city after city in America, there was after the Ferguson shooting, Michael Browning's Ferguson in particular, which was a complete misrepresentation of what occurred there. That was not a racist shooting, contrary to what was the conventional wisdom. But after that, there was a surge in black deaths, hundreds of additional black deaths, because the cops were too frightened to engage in active policing. So anybody who actually thought that Black Lives Matter genuinely, let alone all lives, in my view, would not support the pattern of activism favoured by the Black Lives Matter movement. Another example, somebody mentioned Jacinta Price, who's an Aboriginal woman, and whose mother, Bess Price, they're both very well-known activists from Central Australia. She disputes the claim, affirmed by Sonia Crooks and others, that there's no notion of violence or hierarchy in Indigenous communities. She argued, based on her own lived experience, that was just a fallacy, and that any attempt to address the problems in Aboriginal communities, particularly remote Aboriginal communities, had to take account of that. And this, what Marcia Langton, another Aboriginal activist woman, described as romanticising nonsense about Indigenous culture, was serving as an obstacle to effective action. Jacinta Price talks about how it was absolutely impossible, in her experience, to actually get feminist lawyers and human rights types to actually assist them in genuine efforts to deal with black crime. So I make an absolute distinction between the earlier civil rights movements, which were entirely worthy and noble movements, and the ghastly mutation of those movements, that is modern identity politics. Anyway, that's we're getting into all the subjects.
Yeah.
Anybody else want to have a two bobs worth? Put your hand up. Andris will go on all day, but nobody else?
I can have a go, but I
Oh,
think
you got to go, Anthony.
someone else should have a go.
Yeah, have a crack.
Oh, me? Okay. Well, it's identity politics. Basically, many of these things are not really concerned with the rights of people or even groups of people. They're concerned with gaining power. They're concerned with setting up an establishment which will enable the people who lead it to represent themselves as representing all the various people that they're claiming to represent, but really to enable themselves to get power and to exercise it, rather than to solve the problems that they're purportedly trying to face. And the Uluru Statement from the Heart is a classic case of that.
Okay.
I'd throw that in. I might add.
Somebody just Sheree just corrected me on something. I got Ayanna Presley's name wrong. I think I said Alicia Presley. It's apparently Ayanna. Anyway, Sheree's seeking the call. Off you go, Sheree.
Yeah, just going back to what Andris said before, he was talking about the need for people who belong to minority and oppressed groups to stand together when it comes to advancing the causes of those groups. That's all well and good, but there's also, like, I can pose a different situation. As a Jewish person who is interested in the rights of Palestinians, and I'm in a couple of groups that are trying to further those objectives. I have been, and other people have been, called self-hating Jews and all sorts of things because we don't apparently conform to the majority views or set of views, and so on. So it can work both ways. Like, if you actually believe in human rights and you are trying to advance those across the board in a universal way, like Andris is saying, sometimes you may be conceivably going against the majority in your own group in order to try and assist the human rights of people in another group. So there you go.
Okay.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. But the point is this, that I wish,
mispronounce it.
Andris, yeah. I wish we turned to really critical issues for our times here, like the identity politics of Trump, which is actually absolutely in that category of catastrophic dividing of the country and the world. And the identity politics of the Chinese Communist Party, both of them putting their own self-interest against the universal justice situation. And I think these are very, very important issues. In that sense, couldn't agree with you more, Peter, that identity politics can be extremely divisive. But then if I come back to other identity politics, I would strongly argue, if I go back to Shireen, for example, I also come from a Jewish background, and I totally agree with you that I think what Zionism asserts in its extreme form is incredibly counterproductive, because to me the guide, as I said, a unicentric approach, is reconciling the individual interest and the collective interest in a unicentric win-win way. Now, an approach to the problem in the Middle East, which advances the cause of Jews at the expense of Palestinians, backfires on both. It perpetuates war and it perpetuates injustice. So one mustn't be afraid of prevalent views. That's not the issue. The issue to me is to be bound by the principle of universal human rights. And in that, you can successfully reconcile both the individual good and the collective good. And if one approach, like the extreme Zionist approach, goes against it, then it's up to all of us to stand up and say, no, I disagree with you. Yeah.
Andris, can I just ask a question?
Yeah.
You referred to the identity politics of Trump. Can you elaborate, please?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I think this is terribly important because, as we all know, Trump is completely narcissistic. He lives in a Trumposphere, his own universe.
That's not identity politics.
He identifies, well, no, he is totally narcissistic. That is, he has his own interest. His interest is self-promotion to gain power. And he identifies himself with the nation. I am the nation. So if you follow me, if you take what I advocate to you, you are a good citizen. If you disagree with me, then you are fake. You are unpatriotic. Yeah, that's totally divides, absolutely divides. So he's very much into identity politics.
Identity politics. I don't quite follow you.
What don't you follow?
You can say that Trump has many grave defects. He says a lot of stupid stuff sometimes. Sometimes his instincts are right, but he's a bit of a mixed bag. But I don't see how you're making the connection to identity politics. You're seeming to use that as kind of a universal condemnation for by which you address every bad thing or adverse thing about some political personality you're ascribing to identity politics. So I'm just asking you to. So if I had to characterize Trump's position in his what he's expressed, he's some people would say he's an ethno-nationalist, but he's never talked about the white race or the white people as having some distinctive identity that he identifies with. In fact, where's he done that?
He talked about the shithole African countries. Remember that? He talks about putting America first at the expense of other countries. It doesn't care about other
nationalism.
Right? Now,
but there's an important distinction there between civic nationalism, where you say, I'll put my country first, or as distinct from ethno-nationalism. I think you're trying to put a square peg in a round hole here, which is not criticisms of Trump, but just
no. He claims to want to make America great, yet he does everything in his power to make China great. He completely destroys his own nation by driving people to go back to work when they haven't faced the issue of dealing with the coronavirus issue. And he is destroying his own nation for his own ego. This is a classic identity politics of the worst divisive kind.
Identity politics in any... Sorry, Andrew is going to sort us out. The young philosophical PhD will clarify the issues for us.
Well, yeah, it sounded like we were getting down the rabbit hole a bit there, and I think pulling back to trying to define identity politics at the beginning, Andris, I believe you contrasted it between the Sonia Crick's definition and you cited Wikipedia definition. I think if you're going to apply it to Trump, which definition are you going with? Are you going with the Crook's definition, like supremacy, or are you talking about the Wikipedia definition you gave? It was on that shared disadvantage among groups and responding to it. What you could try and say is that, well, maybe with Trump on his base will say, okay, the white working class, right-wing working class are being, kind of oppressed or disadvantaged in some way, and you could say, well, maybe that's bad identity politics because that's wrong, or you might disagree with that. I'll let you elaborate back on that. I think so. Go back to what you're saying there, because I am familiar with the Wikipedia definition, which I think is consistent with the history of the concept, which is basically identity. If you want to call something identity politics, you can legitimately call it that, as if it's groups based on their identity collectively coming together to challenge some perceived oppression or disadvantage. Now, that perceived oppression or disadvantage could be true or it could be false. You can talk about that afterwards, but that is identity politics. You've got groups of people based on something about their identity where there's been some, at least perceived, oppression or disadvantage, and they're collectively coming together to try and challenge that. So that can be a universal there. So I think a lot of these arguments around what you might say what's good identity politics and what's bad identity politics, and that can easily be the case. But more often than not, I see people generalizing and saying identity politics is intrinsically or universally bad, and that's where I have a problem with it. But if you want to say, there's good and bad identity politics, yeah, I agree. I think there's lots of good and bad identity politics out there. But I think that is ultimately what identity politics is, and then we just go into detail on whether it's good kind or the bad kind, or whether it's right or whether it's wrong. I'll let you get back to it, though.
Anybody else want to correct?
Well, I'll have a go if you like on
Sure.
identity politics. Yes. Well, of course, Hillary Clinton initially tried to get elected by identifying particular identities, LGBT, blacks, Mexicans, etc., to build up a number of groups who would give her their support. And of course, she characterized those opposing her by giving them a group name called the Deplorables. So that was an invalid, I think, a very bad instance of group politics or identity politics, condemning anybody who supported Trump as being deplorable. There's another subtle thing, though, when we're raising the issue of the Chinese. China doesn't have a concept of nation in the way we might have a concept of a nation as being a government of a people within a defined border. So that there is, after the Treaty of Westphalia, basically the nation was made up of people of whatever religion, whatever branch of Christianity within a defined border. But Chinese don't have that. They believe in a nation being the ethnic group of Chinese. So they believe that the Chinese, wherever they may, or ethnic Chinese, wherever they may be located, owe a primary loyalty back to China. So I just throw that in for what it's worth.
Can I might just I'll give an example of odious identity politics. I think it's a rather revealing one. Take the question of Muslim identity, which nowadays, people talk about Islamophobia, which is kind of conflated with racism. It's a species of racism, according to the identitarian ideology. So, in other words, rather than it's a way of looking at it, so that a religion is not a set of tenets that you may subscribe to or not, whether you are born into a Muslim community or not. It's an aspect of your identity. So that a Muslim, and a number of times I've given the example of a couple of examples. Sarah Haider is a young American from Pakistani Muslim background who decided she didn't like Islam and left the religion and became a vocal critic and set up a group called the Ex-Muslims of North America, which is devoted to providing mutual support to people who defect from Islam, which is a very serious step because according to Islamic theology, the penalty for that is death, which is obviously not implemented in the West, but in a dozen or so Islamic countries it is. It is actually in the criminal code. She gave an address to the American Humanist Society where she described the response when she defected from Islam. And she made it clear, she said, I expected to be denounced by Islamic groups. That was, what she expected. But she said she was denounced in equally vehement terms by her erstwhile colleagues in the progressive left, who called her names like Uncle Tom, House Arab, native informant. That last one is particularly sinister and particularly significant because she's an identity traitor. She's not somebody who formed her own viewpoint about the religion that she was born into. She didn't like it, didn't agree with it, set out to criticise it, set out to encourage others to defect. In other words, that right enshrined in the UN Declaration of Human Rights, that people have the right to change their religion as well as to subscribe to whatever religion they want or to adopt no religion. That right, in effect, her progressive colleagues who are infused with identitarian ideology basically vilified and denounced her, Now, I deplore that. That's the renunciation of our Enlightenment heritage. It's treating people as members of a category first and foremost, and as individuals able to exercise agency secondly. And that's exactly what Ayanna Pressley expressed emphatically in that talk that I just mentioned. Okay, next? All right, Sheree, hang on. Oh, there you go. Where are you? Sorry.
Yep. Yeah, I completely agree with you, Peter, but it goes a lot further than that. There are so many around the world, so many Muslim reformers who are still within Islam. They have not left Islam, and they also suffer the same sort of death threats, fatwas, you name it, any amount of them who publish articles and so on. So it's a very big issue and problem. And to just, when people talk about Islamophobia, it frequently is used as a means to shut down any criticism of fundamentalist ideology or all sorts of things that people may wish to make, which are not. So it's very problematic. I think it's a huge problem.
Yeah, in America, the Southern Poverty Law Center, which once upon a time used to be a human rights organization, included in their denunciation of hate groups an English Muslim who hasn't actually left Islam but has become a liberal, an advocate of a liberal form of Islam. He gets denounced by the Southern Poverty Law Center. He actually ended up suing them for defamation and extracting several $1 million out of it. But this is the mentality.
That was Majid Nawaz, wasn't it?
Majid Nawaz, correct.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we're not really processing the chat screen, but I think people are quite entertained by us continuing like this, so we might as well. Like I said, in the chat screen, we can incorporate items in the chat into the debate as it unfolds. There's a lot of interesting comments there, but too many that we'll never get through them. Anyway, who wants to continue on? What about, we haven't talked about the role of the Chinese regime. Oh, here we are, Andris, we mustn't.
Yeah, Simon is asking me, please define justice. Well, justice to me is fair go. If someone, for example, applies for a job, that you give a fair go to the person. You don't allow the color of the skin or religion or whether it's a man or a woman to actually decide whether or not you're going to select someone. Yeah.
Right.
And I still want to emphasize, and going back to China too, that why don't we look at, let's go to the right, because there's a lot of criticism of left engaging in identity politics. But in fact, it seems to me the greater problem is, in fact, the right identity politics. I'm thinking of John Howard, for example, when blacks wants to acknowledge correct history in Australia and acknowledge the devastation of the Aboriginal culture, the murders that took place, the obscenity for us to celebrate Australia Day on the invasion day without acknowledging the pain and the sorrow of the blacks. And when people are actually try to rewrite history in a sense of actually doing justice to history as it happened, then people like John Howard come in and call them the black armband, guys. This is a sort of using identity politics as a stigma. They're saying, you blacks, you should appreciate what we've done for you and, celebrate with us. Don't talk to us about your grievances. Whereas there are a lot of black people now who want to say, we're very unicentric in the sense they want to say, yes, we want to celebrate Australia, but we can only celebrate it properly if it is acknowledged what was done to us. Yeah, and that's really acknowledged and taken into consideration, and that we blacks are seen as a substantial part of Australia's history. Australia's history didn't start with the invasion and the settlement. That we look at celebrating Australia as a very, very ancient nation. And I think that's very important.
Thanks, Andris. Andrew wanted to have a say.
Well, it kind of is deviated away from that. I was just it was more just a cheeky thing where with my definition of justice is from each according to their ability and to each according to their need, and that's enough for me.
Oh, gee, this is getting into
Mr. Marx. Mr. Marx, eh?
Yeah. I have a late uncle, Raymond Baldwin, who was an Oxford Don, who wrote a book in 1966 titled Social Justice. Mm-hmm. The opening paragraph of it goes something like this. It is fashionable nowadays to talk about social justice. In my view, the social in social justice is ooty-oots, because justice by its nature involves relations between men and therefore is inherently social, or something to that effect. That's R.W. Baldwin, Social Justice. Anybody's interested? Yeah. Anthony, did you have your hand?
No, I'm right.
All right. Okay, well, why don't we talk about the one thing I'd like to bring up in this conversation is what's just happening at the University of Queensland. There's a young philosophy student there, 20-year-old philosophy student, whose name is Drew Pavlou. Last year, he organised demonstrations in support of the freedom-seeking people of Hong Kong. And his demonstration was attacked by several hundred people, apparently orchestrated from the Chinese consulate. And the Chinese consul general in Brisbane, after this event, actually praised the people who engaged in this attack as true patriots. So after this happened, there was a violent attack. You can see it on video. The speech rights of this Drew Pavlou and others who were activists in a number of Chinese ethnic students who were from Hong Kong or supportive of Hong Kong, Tibetans, subject to a violent attack. Now, you would think that a university administration, after something like that, would say, well, we better investigate this and find out who the perpetrators are and deal with them, because that shouldn't be tolerated anywhere, let alone at a university. But far from doing that, the university has embarked on a campaign against the student, Drew Pavlou, who organised that. And in fact, they brought to bear their law firm, Clayton Utz, who filed an 86-page indictment of him and which was supposed to have been heard last week by the university, by a tribunal of the university, with the goal, with the penalty apparently of expulsion. Now I don't know what happened about that, because Drew Pavlu and the QC who agreed to represent him pro bono, Tony Morrison, actually walked out of the proceedings because they were so ludicrously devoid of procedural fairness. But so you've got a university who sees a situation like that, and instead of trying to restore or ensure the speech rights of the student, they actually persecute the student. And this was done very much in response to the University of Queensland. About 20% of their students are fee-paying Chinese students. So they're about half of the total number of foreign students. And what is amazing about it, and this is where I come back to identity politics, where were the left-wing groups on campus? Where was the staff union? The University of Queensland hosts a Confucius Institute. Confucius Institutes are acknowledged by Chinese officials as part of the soft propaganda apparatus of the regime, which is a totalitarian regime. So you've got a student being persecuted for organising demonstrations against a totalitarian regime, and yet and everybody is seemingly quite comfortable, except for a handful of dissidents, with having a Confucius Institute on campus, which the National Association of Scholars in America put out a report on Confucius Institutes in America, which indicated that they're actually quite sinister. That they're they're about soft propaganda, obviously, but they get into other things like surveillance of Chinese national students, trying to exercise, and even allegations of espionage in some cases. This is in America. But where are all the progressives? Where were the staff unions, which were so militant in opposing the Ramsay proposal? Where were the... I actually looked up the student clubs at the University of Queensland. There's a Socialist Alliance Club, which has nothing to say about it. Nothing. There's a Green Club. Nothing to say about it. So so there's this mentality. I quoted Pascal Bruckner that in my talk where he says that, the whole current of Western intellectual thinking recently has been very much about vilifying our own civilization and overlooking the faults of others. This just seems to exemplify it. A university is bullying a dissident student who should be supported after having been subjected to violent attack. Andris, you want to come into
Peter, you're absolutely right. But there is a very, very deep issue which we're still not facing in Australia. Now it's starting to come to the fore. It is that we want to have it both ways. We want to have the benefits of short-term greed of getting cheap Chinese stuff, and we want to sell our stuff to China. At the same time, we don't want to compromise our sovereignty, right? The two are impossible objectives. Now, ever since Whitlam went to China and Nixon went to China, the West jumped to bed with China in the name of building up profits. So really the guilty partner there is the transnational capitalists who saw a fantastic opportunity to make lots of money out of China, and they hijacked democracies, our own greed, to persuade us that that was good for us. It's actually led to almost complete industrialization of developing nations. They lost their textile industries, and we in the developed nations lost still things like car industries, steel industries, etc. But we still don't face this issue. We can't have our cake and eat it with China. We still won't say no We've got to wean ourselves off to China. And we are the Frankenstein who created the monster of this regime in China, because we poured capital into this country, which is the enemy of democracy. And this was driven by the transnationals. They hate democracy, because in democracy you have to have environmental considerations, you have to pay proper wages, yeah, you have to deal with lots of authorities to get your stuff approved. In China, you just go to the dictators and bang, 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 you get cheap labor, right? So we've got all these goods we got cheaply from China, but the enormous cost of it, which you mentioned in what's happening in Queensland, in that university, and it's happening all over, and Clive Hamilton will be talking about that, is a compromise, the increasing compromising of our sovereignty, to the point where we will become China's satellite state if we continue this policy of this delusion that we can maintain relying on China for our commerce and retain our sovereignty. And what you see in Queensland is this shocking situation of a financial dependence on China, allowing that to sacrifice our sacred value of freedom of expression and criticizing oppression. This is shocking, and this is happening to the whole Chinese diaspora in Australia. You know that they got no freedom of expression in this country because they're terrified to open their mouth. If they do it, their families back in China will be penalized. So we already got this substantial minority here who have no freedom of speech because of the bullying of China. I'll leave it at this point here.
Well, that's the really shocking thing, Andris, is that you and I agree completely about something. I made a joke. Andris is not amused. You've frozen up. Oh, okay. Anybody else want to? Yes, here we go. Sheree's going to jump in.
Yeah, I completely agree with both of you. And I think it's very interesting, though, right now, with the coronavirus situation, that this is the first time in recent history that finally we do see across the spectrum criticism of Chinese government behavior, which I don't recall seeing it to this extent in a bipartisan way in the calling for the investigation, and China's ridiculous reaction to that, how overboard they've gone with that, and how, which is typical of their behavior. But in this environment, many people are starting to really think, well, what are you on about? What do you have against? What objection do you have to a fair investigation that can actually look at what caused things, how things were dealt with, how can we do better next time? Who in their right mind would actually oppose that? It's in everybody's interest. And so people are really up in arms, I think, at their attitude. And this is a chance to actually rethink the whole thing and get a lot of people across the world finally taking notice, because they've been doing this for bloody decades. It's nothing new, but finally people are starting to take notice because of this the pandemic.
Yeah. All right. Anybody? No, it's I think it's profoundly disturbing, but as I said, the thing I find a little odd about it is, well, more than a little odd, is the quiescence of activists on university campus. Same situation, Sydney University, where you know, the Vice Chancellor there, Michael Spence, when the government introduced legislation last year to restrict foreign interference in Australian political affairs, Spence felt compelled to come out with a statement saying we need to be careful about xenophobic blatherings. You know? And again, Sydney University is in the same position as the University of Queensland, with a very high level of dependency on Chinese fee-paying students, which the regime can turn off like a tap if they choose to do so. And in the University of Queensland, they get $300 million a year from the Chinese students. So they're in that very difficult situation. So what I find really depressing is that over in Hong Kong, the university unions in Hong Kong are full on, very militant about it. And you get in Queensland, the president of the student union actually said something about Drew Pavlou, the dissident, and described him as being unbalanced or something. And yet, over in Hong Kong, where they really are at risk, they're in the jaws of a dragon, so to speak, the student groups are very active and full in opposition. Andris.
Well, Peter, the theme of your criticism of identity politics is a threat to our civilization. Well, let's look at two essential threats here. And I think they come from within. The first one is the identity politics of transnational capitalism, because they put profit above the maintenance of democracy. They have been quite happy to denigrate democracies all over the world and build China up into the monster its regime it is now for the sake of money. And this is very important to see that the greatest danger to our democracy is from within. It is allowing transnational capitalism to hijack democracy. This has been happening now for a very long time. The Murdochs of this world. Look at the Fox News. They dominate the American media. They're selling absolute propaganda to them in place of the facts, which is Trump's universe. The fake reality becomes the reality, and the real reality is labeled fake. This is all 1984, the newspeak, very prostitute words. You call the truth lie, and you call the lie truth. Now, transnationals have been playing this game for a long time, and it is time for the democracies to rein in transnationals. And there's nothing wrong with transnationals as long as they serve the interest of democracies. But they're far more interested in allying with autocracies because there's more profit for them in that. So that's the number one threat to our civilization. The number two threat is the Chinese regime. So we got the Frankenstein, which is us, particularly the transnational aspect of capitalist democracy. And this Frankenstein, who is us, created the monster. It is our capital investment in China. It's our reliance on making China the factory of the world that built a China that was about collapsing after Mao's Cultural Revolution. We allowed China not only to this criminal regime, not only to survive, but become stronger and fulfill the ambition to rule the world. And China wants to buy the world. And if we play into its hand through our commerce and absolute involvement in that, they will buy and say goodbye to democracy. So the two major enemies of democracy are unfettered laissez-faire transnational capitalism, which is not made subordinate to democracy. And the second is the alliance between this transnational capitalism and the Chinese state capitalism. They become such a formidable force that democracies have no chance of surviving if they are allowed to get away with it. But if Australia weaned itself of China and didn't buy into this notion that the sky will fall in if we make India, Indonesia, other developing countries as our factory, that's what we want, and wean ourselves off China, and we form an alliance of democracies, we can prevent China We can definitely prevent China from ruling the world. But if we keep maintaining China as the factory of the world, we make ourselves completely dependent economically on China. And remember that. Remember when 24 countries signed a declaration condemning the concentration camps of the Uyghurs. What did China do? This is incredible. It's got more than 50 countries to sign a counter petition to the United Nations saying, no. China is really doing the right thing with the Uyghurs. This is how far they have gone in taking over the international system. And if we are not forming, if we don't pull out and be ally, and we don't stand together as democracies, we can say goodbye to our democracies.
Hang on.
Back to you.
I keep stuffing this up. Yeah, I agree with an awful lot of that. I mean, I think what you've got at the moment is a combination of the globalist corporations, if you like, the globalist ideology that sees nothing problematical about the redistribution of work that's gone in the world. I mean, everybody wants to see the Chinese people prosper, but to have created this state of dependency, particularly in things like basic pharmaceuticals, where a very large proportion of those are currently sourced in China. It puts us in a terrible situation of vulnerability. And so it's true. But the point I was drawing attention to was that the sort of people who, I'm old enough to remember when the left used to be really suspicious and hostile towards big corporations. But nowadays, corporations like Google, because they embrace the identitarian ideology and fire people like James Damore, the young software engineer who was fired for saying something which deviated from, where he said, the reason that you don't have an equality of women in software programming is because men and women tend overall to have different preferences, not different aptitudes, but different preferences as to the kind of work they do. That was the firing offence in Google. And this is the same Google that at one point was collaborating with the Chinese regime in developing a web browser that would exclude non-favoured search terms. I think they've kind of been pressured out of participating in that project. But the situation in the universities, this takeover in the universities, this ability to pressure universities using the financial stick. Why isn't there opposition to it? Well, because when people do that, there's an accusation, the accusation's made racism, just as the imposition of travel bans at the early stages of the COVID epidemic, that was denounced as racism and xenophobia by progressives. So you've got a conjunction of these two forces combining to undermine our capacity to think clearly about these problems.
Yeah.
This is nodding. So we're actually sort of working towards agreement here. Okay. Anybody else want to bring up an issue? Are we running out of steam? We've been going for nearly an hour and a half.
I have got one minor point questioner. One Tim Dane says China would still be a backward peasant society if not for the Communist Party. Now, the problem with that is that China would be a lot further ahead if it was not for the Communist Party. You've only got to see the difference between, say, mainland China and Taiwan. China was held back by the Great Leap backwards, if you like, of so-called Great Leap forward, and that pulled China back. When Deng Xiaoping took over, he basically reversed the disaster that was Mao's policies. But the rest of that comment, I think, is got some point in it. But I think we should not pretend that China's advance was because of the Communist Party. It was held back for years and suffered an estimated 20 million deaths because of the Communist Party.
All right.
70 million deaths, I think I should have said.
We must be getting, hang on, how long do we want to go, panelists? You want to go for another 10 minutes or so?
Yeah.
I'm fine for that.
So we'll wind up at, let's say, 5:35 then. Okay. Andris, anybody else wanting to? Andrew, do you want to have a crack at something?
No, like I'm mostly in agreement with the what's been discussed in our last topic there. I haven't read too much up on the latest stuff regarding China of the university. I've seen some things, but I didn't have much to add there. So yeah, I mean, I suppose you might bring it. But sorry. No, you go.
No, I'll put you back on. Where are you? Yeah, there you go.
I mean, I think the context you wanted at the beginning was to talk about the nature of debates. Is that still the case, or did we kind of?
Oh, well, that was
track away from that?
We seem to have gotten into other matters.
Yeah. I came in thinking we were gonna talk about how to debate now. But yeah, I get it's fine. Yeah. I wanted to say something, right?
We haven't really been able to deal with the chat stream because we've been arguing discussing with each other. So we can consider the chat stream after the event. And, no doubt there'll be a lot of interesting points.
I suppose what I could say this there is like, when just to remind people, like with everything that's there, like every claim that's being made, that requires fact checking backwards and forward. It's like it'd be very difficult to draw a fundamental conclusion over any argument that's made today. It's like, the devil's always in the details. So that's why I enjoy things like complementing what's happening today with Peter's online written format, because then you can get more into the details and see what's true, what's false, and what follows, what doesn't. All
right, thank you.
Peter.
Yeah, you're on.
I'd like to give a local example where identity politics is actually a win-win one, where in fact identity politics can pursue an issue which is good for everyone. So there is a no-loser solution. Right now, there is a big struggle going on, as you're all aware, being from this area, that the transport department wants to double the highway in the upper mountains, right? So now, on the bag, the Blackheath Action Group, a lot of us united to, in fact, as an identity politics issue, this is a classic example of that. We identify with saving the Blue Mountains, and saving Blackheath at the same time. So we've got our own unique interest, which is Blackheath, but we also have the more universal interest of the Blue Mountains, of Sydney, of the Greater West, of Australia, and through World Heritage, the whole world. What's being proposed here is what the objective of the government's policy is: to improve transport, to get more freight to the West. They propose to do that by doubling the highway in the upper mountains. And what we need to understand that the only buffer to mega trucks, mega freight trucks of 30-meter size, is the fact that the highway hasn't been doubled in the upper mountain. Now we as a group say that, wait a minute, this highway is not even a highway. It's a simple road just dubbed as a highway. It's a suburban way with 11 schools, driveways.
got to do with identity politics? This is all very well.
Very much an identity.
Blackheath is an identity. I mean, I'm not sure what you're saying here.
The identity is that we in Blackheath identify with the interest of the Blue Mountains, because what we're saying is that the moment the highway is doubled in the upper mountains, every village in the mountains will lose one lane.
Yeah, that's all true, but I just don't see what that's got to do with identity politics. I mean,
it's to do with the identity of the Blue Mountains. Are we going to keep the integrity of the Blue Mountains?
Every imaginable thing that comes up, whether you're pro or con, frankly. No, you see, that's good, to have these community groups, but unless you're going to say being a resident of Blackheath is an identity, what isn't an identity? Being a stamp collector, I suppose that's a model train enthusiast. I mean, you can say anything. That's
Come on, Peter. We're talking about the maintenance of the identity of the Blue Mountains. We're saying that there is a win-win solution if we upgrade the Bilpin line of road, if we double the freight rail and transfer mega freight from the road to the rail.
That's right. Okay.
Then we can retain the identity, and the maintenance of this identity will be good for the whole of the mountains and the whole of Australia. There is a win-win thing here.
Andris, I'm sorry to say, I think that's a long bow. Anyway, Sheree wants to have something to say, I think.
Well, I'm just looking on the chat line. There's a lot of chat going on about China still. A point I wanted to make was it's often said by apologists for China, they talk about the hundreds of millions of people lifted out of poverty and so on. However, you never hear much analysis of what that has meant in reality. For a lot of millions and millions of these people are now transported often 1,000 kilometers from their home village, living in squalid dormitories in the large cities where they are essentially slaves living in tiny little dormitories, but masses of people all squashed together and working 6-7 days a week round the clock, having an annual pilgrimage back to visit their family. So you have thousands and thousands of towns throughout China where there's only elderly people and young people and still some women, but most of the population in between are in the cities somewhere slaving away. Is that actually such a wonderful achievement? Like, it could be argued that money could have been better spent by improving the standard of living in those villages so that people could actually stay in their towns and develop the rural economy as well, because now perhaps China wouldn't have to be going all around the world looking for land to take over to feed their population if they'd actually assisted their own communities in better production of crops and so on, rather than forcing people into industrialized slum living so far from their own homes. I don't see that as a great quality of life when you can see your own family once a year.
I just noticed somebody wants to know, Andrew, what's the title of your book and where can they get it? There you go. You can score a sale today.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Well, thanks, Simon. Yeah, it's I've just actually I saw that. I've just popped it into the live chat, the Amazon link. But thanks. But the title of the book is Contrasting Identities: Navigating Identity Politics Conversations. But yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, sorry.
I bought one on the Kindle format. Look, I think, what do we call it a day? I just can I just conclude? Thank all our panelists. I think it's been a great discussion, and I'd like to thank everybody viewing and everybody contributing via the chat window, and just urge anybody who wants to keep these interesting debates going to please click the links to get onto the site and get our debate going, and so we can explore these matters in the sort of detail that they deserve. So, thank you, everyone. Well, I think we'll end the broadcast at this point. I'll click the link to end the broadcast. And
thank you, Peter. Thank you, everyone.